Because we touched on it then. So as it becomes more, AI becomes more integrated into user experience design, guess what ethical considerations should the designers and developers keep in mind?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of things there. Let's jump off and make a smooth transition from the last question. Like, if we were going to try and use generative AI to find patterns in accessible technologies, we have to be really honest that what we're doing, assuming that we're doing it on a commercial side, is what we're doing is we're taking all of that data about people who are excluded from dominant communities, shoving it into a generalized transformer model that will consume their actions and things like that for future inferences, and then spitting out a way that we can better bring them into the fold. Now, there's an altruistic level of it where it's like, I want our shopping experience or our restaurant dining experience or our delivery experience or our media experience to be as accessible as possible, to be as available to people as possible. But the fundamentals in the context that we're stuck in is that to also make money has to be appended on that. And then, you're looking at this whole pipeline where you're taking these accessible actions, this accessible data, and you're pumping it into a model that has some levels of accessibility, but are trained on predominantly, body normative ways of doing things, and getting potential answers to try and make more money. And there's a complication there. It's not easily resolved. Part of the challenge is living in the complication, and humans are the only ones who are going to be able to make that decision. Like, classic kind of business turn of phrase, is the juice worth the squeeze? But the question is, like, is the juice like ethically worth the squeeze? Or, how do we think about that in relationship not only to that kind of disability paradigm, but also inclusivity paradigms, and then also just privacy paradigms. Like, all of these come with these new questions. And I think one of the cool things about now is that we're exploring. We're definitely as a social whole, in a utopian way, in a global exploration phase of everybody trying to figure out what this new dawn and tomorrow looks like. But I think that we're going to start running into places where we have to answer these more difficult questions of like, okay, what are we actually doing? Thinking of inclusivity, you've got Google, who's really struggling with image generation lately, and it was an interesting conversation, especially around these like diverse depictions of anti-diverse organizations. It was like all of the memes about diverse Nazis going around in terms of Google's image generation. There were some great conversations, and I think that's also very valuable in terms of this space, is that it does prompt people to start having conversations not only about their privacy, but also things like representation. And it's uncomfortable, and sometimes, we have to figure out ways to keep people safe in those conversations. But I do think at the end of the day, it's valuable to prompt the conversation around things like accessibility, privacy, diversity, how we get along as a society. That's ultimately going to start to fall on those user experience shoulders as the interfaces become the thing that people interact with Gen AI through.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it earlier. Look, we still need that. Technology is not going to take over. We still need that human oversight, don't we? We need the double check.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the most exciting thing is that we get to have these new conversations, right? So one of the things I have noticed as we explore, Gen AI and find pathways to production, is we're starting to move away from as many conversations, like we're still having them about like classic engineering, operations, scalability, cost, latency, performance, to also these other conversations where engineers are starting to weigh in on like, well, is this the right way to do this? Like, what are the ethics of this? Is there an element of creativity and, humanity that we lose by having generative AI take this feature or that feature? Like, what are these trade-offs? And I think what's good for us, especially in the technology world, is that we're having these philosophical conversations almost detached from the core conversation of technological enablement. There's a lot of stuff. A lot of people have spilled a lot of ink talking about the way technology philosophically approaches the world. And what's interesting about Gen AI is it's become such a kind of democratic force, is that now everybody's having these interesting conversations that are no longer purely grounded by, is technology good? it's introducing shades of gray, and it's introducing debates, and that makes everyone better. That's how we all get somewhere better together.
Yeah, and I think now everyone now it's a race to get their data, isn't it? I mean, look, everyone's focused on data engineering, data management, data governance. That's key now. As quicker you get that intact, then you can get more data, and then that's feeding you more information and it giving you insights.
Yeah, the recent announcement that, places like Tumblr and WordPress are going to provide data to AI. Like, part of me is absolutely terrified to see what a Tumblr-powered Gen AI chat agent looks like, because it's a weird place. It's not a bad place. Like, some parts of it, like any other part of the internet, is bad, but there's also parts of it that are just like the most excitingly mundane things. It's kids talking about like their favorite anime, and it's people exploring their gender and their sexuality. And I think that there's a big question there of, like, first off, like, from a user experience, like, you've got this chat agent designed off this strange data set, what's that like? But there's also this historical component of, to the philosophical debates we we're just talking about. It's like, if I were in my 20s, I think the question I would be trying to figure out is, like, did 13-year-old me produce this content in a way that they would be happy if I told them, like, came from the future and said, hey, this is going to be used to train, like, robots to talk to you. I can't imagine many 20-year-olds are excited about their 13-year-old self powering decision-making engines, right? And even beyond like the kind of cliche of that, I do think there is an element of privacy and data sovereignty that we do have to ask in those regards. Of, like, this data was never made for these purposes. Nobody ever agreed to that when they created the data. So what's happening with these, after the fact, post hoc license changes that allow companies to do this? And I do think that there's some value in us, yes, it's interesting from a legal perspective, and I have friends in law who are having these conversations and really excited and interested in them. But I think there's a broader framework to have that conversation that we should be talking about is, what did 13-year-old me want, and is this actually valuable? Yeah. And would this comply with that? And that's, if the answer is no, that's where we're going to start to see things like, artists now poisoning their artwork to prevent bots. We're even starting to see LinkedIn posts with poison because people are getting so many ChatGPT bot responses to LinkedIn posts. It's just an interesting moment where there is a little resistance outside the framework of your typical legal frameworks that we have to work through together.
Yeah, I think, like, you can definitely tell what's a ChatGPT post on LinkedIn now.
Yeah.
It stands out.
Yeah, and it's nothing about it that is wrong, and it's nothing about it that is perfect, right? Because the flip side is something too good to be true. There's just, one of my favorite German philosophers, Walter Benjamin, has this essay called The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility. And there's just something he talks about, like, of a piece of art. Like, you look at an original piece of art, and there's just something about it that feels peoply, right? Like, it was made for humans by humans. And I think what's fascinating about the LinkedIn space with all these ChatGPT bots is you look at it and there's nothing that stands out to you as though it is not written by a person, but there is something about it that just feels inhuman. It doesn't have an aura, as Benjamin would call it. And I think there's a lot of fun that is going to be had by artists and cultural critics and folks outside the data space with generative AI, having it generate even more aura-less things as acts of resistance or parody. There's going to be this, I think that there's going to be a really wonderful surrealist moment. I think we're going to have some fun political art in the style of those late, like, 20th century artists. There's going to be some cool, weird Banksy stuff that it's just such an awesome moment from a cultural production perspective. And you're just going to get this lovely smattering of, Magritte's and Picasso type works and performance works. And it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. Next text to video is going to be that'd probably be slated. That'd be next on LinkedIn, wouldn't it? The posts, there'd be just onslaught of that. Obviously, I guess people want to get their point across, but I think Like you want that again personalized touch, don't you? You want that actually feel that you're getting the feel from the person, not from the computer.
Yeah, and I do worry, in a long-term kind of way, like thinking about like the big horizon. I do worry that the Gen AI moment is going to oversaturate in some ways, where we're going to have this flip back to the love of things that are curated. I think I think it was Roku that essentially went to hand curating everything again for a brief moment of time, and everybody kind of poked fun at it. But I think they were seeing something or had their fingers on a pulse that's very interesting, because like the LinkedIn posts, if everything on Netflix is kind of something you'd watch but not quite, feels kind of empty, you might not enjoy that experience. Whereas if you have someone there who's saying like, look, this cultural moment, it requires us pulling out the Jurassic Parks and the 28 Days Later and these other kind of quasi-economic horror video, like movies, that's going to feel something more human and attractive than a highly personalized robotic list of like, these are the things I think you're going to love. And that's just the thing that I'm a little fearful of. Maybe not fearful, but something I see on the horizon, especially as like Meta, for example, I think just released its first generalizable recommendation model. There's a lot of questions about how do you use it, what do you do with it, etc. But that has that risk of just over personalizing, over blanketing, and to the prior conversation, you lose the aura, the magic of movies and movie recommendations and curation.
Yeah, because probably just keep getting like on Netflix, or if you keep getting recommended films, you're gonna ignore it in the end, don't you? It's gonna get it'll dilute its appeal to you, wouldn't it? You go to recommendations from friends or that sort of thing. So I guess obviously companies have got to be careful in terms of the effort they put in, making sure it is of a high standard. Because if it drops below someone's expectation, that it's just gonna like weaken their product.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to make it just every other product with a different colored skin on it. And with the personalization of coloring, like we were just talking about with like branding, it's going to be almost like any product, right? Like there's just nothing that's Netflix aside from what I could search for that's different from Max, that's different from Paramount Plus, that's different from Peacock, etc. Like I don't think that that's a good world. I think that's a bridge too far to a world we don't actually want to live in.
Yeah, definitely.